Welcome to the Inclusive Teaching Panel. This session originally took place on August 27th, 2020. We have permission from each speaker to share this recording with new teaching fellows as part of the Spring 2021 Teaching at Yale Day. You will receive an email on Thursday, January 28th, asking you to confirm that you have watched this recording. Please complete the 2-question survey to ensure you receive full participation for Teaching at Yale Day. Finally, we want to thank our panelists for an engaging conversation. Larry Gladney, Professor of Physics and the Phyllis A. Wallace Dean of Diversity and Faculty Development in the Yale Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Emily Greenwood, Professor of Classics and of African American Studies at Yale. Rona Ramos, the Graduate Program Coordinator for the Department of Physics at Yale. And Julie McGurk, Director of Faculty Teaching Initiatives at the Yale Poorvu Center for Teaching and Learning. Let's jump right in.
Definition for what we mean by inclusive teaching. And let me just say that in my view, it's the range of approaches to teaching that considers the diverse needs and backgrounds of all of our students by creating a learning environment where all those students feel valued and where they all have equal access to learning. There are many ways in which we can describe, and you're going to hear during the course of this workshop and looking through the videos, various methods by which you can do that. But I'll start by saying that from my point of view and what I represent through my office is that we value diversity at Yale by what we do, not by simply what we say or put on websites. And in order to say what we do values diversity, it means that the faculty, the staff, and the student body all recognize the importance of diversity and equity in the learning process. Our university and our department statements on diversity can be inspiring, but they often leave us wondering, how do we actually do that, right? How do we foster a diverse and equitable environment? And how do I really reach all of my students, particularly as we think about the fact that the Yale undergraduate population now is considerably more diverse than it was even just a few years ago. So inclusive teaching is the answer to that, right? It helps you begin to answer those questions at the very least. But it's important to understand that the set of principles that guide us in this, that are the core of what we mean by inclusive teaching, are all based on the importance of having an environment in which people can learn from each other. That is, our faculty, our staff, our students, even our alums have to all feel as though that they have a home here so that we properly can focus on the idea that we're learning from each other. That's really the purpose of a university, bringing people together to learn from each other. So if we consider what we need to do beyond simply presenting the disciplinary content, what do we mean by providing a learning environment which is inclusive and equitable? We have to first focus on the fact that the purpose of any learning environment is to have learning outcomes. And so the focus on what the outcomes have to be guides us in sort of a backwards design principle as to what we need to be doing in the classroom and how we need to be fostering the behavior of students outside of the classroom, where we know that a good deal of learning also takes place. So what that means for us as instructors is specifically that the student's sense of belonging is really up to us, right? Everyone has to sort of bring their best selves to the class in order to gain anything out of it. But the power, comfortable, that feels safe for students to actually explore and to understand that if they need help, they can depend on us to help provide that, is our power. That is, as instructors, we are the ones who really guide that. And so that means that our teaching practices have to reflect the learning outcomes that we want for our students. We develop supportive relationships with students. That's the very first thing, and that requires communications that are open and that imply to students that at every step, that whatever they want to say to us, we're open and available to listen, to hear, and then to respond. So very recently, just yesterday, if you're an instructor, you may have seen a note that a committee I chaired this summer put out about what the core responsibilities are for instructors and for students in our classes, particularly in a pandemic environment with predominantly online teaching. The very first part of that is communications, and the clarity of communications and the frequency of communications that are necessary in order to make a learning environment in which the outcomes can be fairly assessed requires us to understand where our students are, and for our students to feel safe in telling us if there are any difficulties or any obstacles that occur for their learning. We also want to do in that communication the kinds of encouragement for taking intellectual risks, for persisting when they come across difficult materials, which they inevitably will. And then we want to provide them some context for which it's important for them to retain the learning that they get through our course. Fairly often we can be in a situation where we're presenting things because it's necessary for them to have this as background for the next thing they're going to learn. But it's not as often that we actually describe to students in very realistic terms why this material matters to them. Whether we're talking about classics or organic chemistry, it's really important to communicate to students not only our passion and our enjoyment of the subject matter, but also why it matters to them that they have the same opportunity to experience the same degree of passion and excitement around the material that we have. So I'm going to stop with that and simply say that the teaching methodologies that you're going to learn are really important for exactly those reasons, right? The learning outcomes that we want to have are only realized, and certainly optimally realized, when we make an environment that is inclusive for all of our students to feel as though they can not only engage with the material, but provides them the encouragement to continue with it when things become difficult or when they have to think about making time trade-offs with other subjects. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that. And that plug for supporting students through the difficult parts of their learning and helping them to be resilient is crucially important. Thank you. Perhaps Emily, we could have you go next.
Good morning, everyone. It's good to be here. So I'm going to talk under two general headings. First of all, I'm going to focus on you and on us as instructors, because the gist of what I'm about to say is that one way of thinking about inclusive teaching is that it's about your and our whole relationship with the academy. And the second part of what I'm going to say is about other-centered learning. So thinking about the students that you'll be teaching and the role that you can play in helping them to feel included, following on from Professor Gladney's remarks. But I guess an even more overarching theme is that what we're talking about when we're talking about inclusive teaching is the sort of omnipresent question or theme that concerns any of us who think about equity or diversity or inclusion in the academy, the question of who gets to teach, who gets to speak with authority and on what. And inclusive teaching, following on from this, is also about learning to claim our place in the academy. So let me confront the obvious, which is it feels a bit rich and hard to be asked to concentrate on inclusive teaching when probably as you're facing your teaching assignments for the semester, you're probably not feeling very included. You're probably feeling quite nervous and estranged at the thought of these classes that you're going to have to come before on Zoom. And I feel that. It's not just a truism. Teaching is always stressful because it's always about a performance. And it's always, as I said, about standing forward and claiming your place. And appearing before a community as someone who has something to say with a measure of authority. So, you know, just to be honest, even here giving this talk now, it's nerve-wracking. It's a performance, and it doesn't matter how long you've been in the academy. It always feels a bit nerve-wracking. And some of the remarks that I'm going to offer are about learning to anticipate that and to use that sense of responsibility and acute performance to build up a set of tools for helping it to feel more natural and more comfortable as the semester goes on and as you continue to gain more experience in your teaching careers. So first of all, inclusion. It seems self-evident, and a lot of diversity literature, when talking about inclusion or equity or diversity, has this phrase where it talks about the feel-good value of inclusion. We can all sign up to it. Who doesn't want to be inclusive? But it's actually a very sort of nuanced and tricksy concept. And one way I think I can illustrate that tricksiness is by talking a little bit about some of the verbal resonances in the word inclusion, in the noun inclusion, and its history. It actually comes from a Latin verb inclaudere, which initially means to fence off or shut in a carcereal sense. So inclusion was about hiving off little communities. And I think that's the first thing that makes inclusion tricksy, because in an academic context, we're talking about inclusion within an exclusive community. So this is one of our foremost paramount challenges. How do we balance that sense of teachers who are responsible for passing on, shepherding, received knowledge or traditional knowledge and expertise, with the need to be alert and cognizant of all the ways in which, if we're not careful, we can fall into the trap of repeating and reperforming tired, dominant cultural scripts, saying things just because we've heard our own professors saying things just because it sounds like the caricature of the authoritative voice in our disciplines. So I think that's part of the nub of why inclusion is a difficult category. It's also, as I said, because in the very moment of being responsible for trying to make the academy an inclusive place, we don't always feel included ourselves. And before I sort of talk about performance, I mean, I want to be very explicit about this. There is a famous feminist pedagogical anthology whose title is Presumed Incompetent. And this is a phrase that I wish I had had in my mind when I started my teaching career, for negotiating all those moments when I felt awkward and uncomfortable, when I found myself at the head of the class and didn't feel like I was the head of anything, but quite frankly felt I was the bottom of anything within the academy. So, you know, I think we need to anticipate and be alert to the ways in which the academy is an imperfect community. We will be excluded in our careers on grounds of race, on grounds of nationality, on grounds of religion, on grounds of sexuality, on grounds of class, you know, what state we come from, what accent we have. And this is part of the anxiety of performance that we feel as we try to claim our pace. But I think one of the most important things I can say in this respect is that you actually have a lot of agency within the classroom to help to model and create the academy that you want to be a part of and the academy that you want to help students thrive in. And I'll go back to the document that Professor Gladney referred to already. It was put out yesterday from the committee that he chaired. It was so heartening to see this set of guidelines for teaching under pandemic conditions, which I think also serve us very well for teaching at all times, because teaching is always a critical occasion where we meet as an interpretative community to deliberate, to pass judgments, to work out what we think and what are the grounds for our knowledge. And that will always do best and be its best version if we remember these values that that committee report highlighted: the importance of listening, the importance of compassion, the importance of patience, and the importance of being transparent and explaining why we're doing what we're doing. So in terms of inclusion, when we're thinking about not falling into the trap of falling back on a dominant cultural script or a tired disciplinary script, there are only two kinds of bad performance. One is if you haven't done the preparation, if you haven't looked at the syllabus, if you haven't done the readings that the students are being asked to do. And the second is if you're trying to ventriloquize a form of borrowed knowledge. So, you know, I've done this myself. Many people who've taught for a long time have caught themselves in the middle of a class saying things like, oh no, Plato never uses that word. Oh no, Thucydides would never say that. Oh no, we don't think that. Oh no, no, that's not the consensus anymore. Oh, this is because, oh, so-and-so says, without saying why we should take so-and-so's word as reliable, or on what grounds so-and-so says that. So I think actually this is where you can use the sense of vulnerability that we all feel to stage a series of dialogic encounters with your students, which will make the classroom more honest and more real and more inclusive, instead of falling into monologues where you are performing a version of authority and often, you know, performing a version of authority that feels anxious because it's not necessarily how you would most naturally present the material. Try and think about what you know and how you know it, as well as the doubts you have and the questions you have. It's fine, and in fact, it's an entirely good thing to admit doubt and uncertainty, to say in response to a query, you know, I'm not sure about that. That's a really good question because it makes me think of the following. I'm going to look into that and get back to all of you with, you know, a better answer than I can give you on the spot. That's all part of creating an inclusive teaching community where you give students roots in, you show them where the difficulties are and how it is that you go about amassing the knowledge that you present in front of the class. There are a very few students at Yale who expect the cult of the omniscient professor, but most students are supremely reassured when they see us saying, you know, actually, I don't know that. I'm going to go and do some more research and I'll report back to you. And are incredibly supportive in those moments as well. What else did I want to say? I think the last thing I'll say before I stop is about the intersection between inclusion and diversity. As I said, these are feel-good terms. As we think ahead and map the semester ahead with an election season, and with the sort of critical stresses that the pandemic has created, opening up and making more explicit seams of inequality that already exist in our communities, the way in which we navigate and attend to diversity in our classrooms will be even more critical this fall. And one phrase that I'd like to give you, it's something I'm thinking of for my own teaching, is a book title. I read a book this summer called The Plural of Us, and the subtitle is about Auden poetry community in the first person plural. And I thought that the plural of us was a really good mnemonic. The author of the book is Bonnie Costello, for reminding us that even when we think we're being inclusive, even when we're using that expansive first person plural, when we talk about we and we talk about our and we talk about us, we can always take that further. We always typically fall short of including everyone and every form of experience that is represented in the classroom. So I think it's helpful in the first class to tackle this explicitly with students and to say that we want to create a climate and a world within the seminars and sections that we're teaching where people can use their unique individual forms of knowledge and experience to help enrich the knowledge that we have collectively as an interpretative community, and just to encourage students to think outside of the limits of their own experience. I often fall into this trap as an instructor. If you identify as a minority on a particular axis, sometimes it's all too easy to fall into forms of righteousness where you sort of think, you know, I'm not being represented, I'm excluded. And in those moments, actually, we're maybe less likely or less well equipped to identify or attend to the other forms of exclusion that are going on in the room at the same time. So I think it's good to make the class as a community responsible for always trying to outthink the boundaries of what plural is, and to think of ourselves as singular plural. How are we present in the class, and how are we representing and helping to make sure that each other are included in the discussion? And sometimes you will find yourself in the delicate position of having to negotiate and to say, no, now we're talking about this, now we're talking about intersectional exclusions along lines of class and gender, and nationality comes into it, but it's not salient in this particular example. Let's flag that up and come back to nationality in the next class. I think as long as you can try and acknowledge that you've heard things, it's fine to sort of say we can't talk about every form of inclusion or exclusion and diversity in a single breath. Okay, I will stop there, and I'm looking forward to the general discussion. Thanks.
Emily, thank you so much for that. I'm not going to say anything because I couldn't add to that, but I will say thank you for inviting us to be our best selves and to be vulnerable before our students, in the interest of expanding that us, that we. Julie, if you would be the next in line to talk to us.
Sure. And so when I was thinking about this question of sort of what is inclusive teaching, I actually wanted to maybe take the tact of thinking about sort of what is it not, or what are the barriers to us thinking that, inclusive teaching is anything other than just excellent teaching, right? So I think Larry started us off with thinking about the fact that inclusive teaching is us teaching all of our students. And I think, I don't think any of us would argue that is what an excellent teacher does. And so why is it that we have to even call something inclusive teaching? Why can't we just call it excellent teaching? And there's a lot that we could do with that, but I wanted to actually focus in to think about the fact that a lot of what is sort of a barrier in that is our sort of misconceptions of what it means to be a rigorous teacher. Because I think a lot of times we say an excellent teacher is a rigorous teacher, and we tend to sort of oppose these ideas of rigor and inclusion as if they're separate and we can't have both in one space. And I think that's nonsense. We know from the literature that we need to be both rigorous and inclusive for all of our students to learn. And in fact, we need rigor to be inclusive. So if we're not rigorous, we're sending the message to our students that we don't believe in their ability to achieve our rigorous standards, right? And so so I want us to really start thinking about what it means to us to be rigorous to help inform our more inclusive practices, right? So when I ask instructors what rigor means to them, they often talk about sort of high standards and pushing students to grow and challenge themselves, right? But when we look at our practices and the things that we call rigorous, those don't often align with our definition. Right, and so a lot of times we think about rigor as being sort of hard for the sake of being hard, right? And we can often sort of see that reflected perhaps in assessments where we have questions that are just tricky for the sake of being tricky, or that we're grading them on standards that we haven't really explicitly taught them. And so, I think going back to this idea of sort of the backwards design, right? That thinking about sort of what is most important, what are the skills that we're trying to teach our students, making sure to grade in line with that, right? If we're grading an essay and we haven't really talked that much about the writing itself, should we be grading the writing, or should we just be grading the ideas that are in that writing? About sort of what's going to be most important, but always in everything that you're doing, really examining sort of what is that big picture, what is that big takeaway, and making sure that we're emphasizing and sort of incorporating that into our classes. Another sort of misconception is that rigor is about students sort of struggling on their own, right? We lecture and then we let students go bang their head against the wall. And what we know about how people learn, that's not often the best way to do it, right? There is the need for the individual to do some of that struggling, but we know that we learn much better when we learn together. And so, you know, in our teaching, thinking about sort of how do we help students connect with each other, right? And so some of the best students will form study groups and use resources and things like that. But especially in this environment, if students don't have the opportunity to get to know each other, they may not be able to form those study groups, be able to form those support networks. And so being very intentional about helping students get to know each other, but then also making sure that you're creating interaction when you're in person, quote unquote, with the students, right? So, you know, letting students talk about their ideas and get some of that feedback from you, right? As they're practicing a problem, they're gonna learn it much better if they can get some instant feedback from you on sort of where they're going wrong. And so, yeah, so it's not just about sort of students struggling on their own, but it's also sort of making that struggle visible, helping students support each other, and you being there and available to sort of support the students. Another sort of misconception is that rigor is about being impersonal and treating everyone the same. But, you know, one of the most important things, especially again in this environment, is making sure that you're noticing students, right? And certainly I've heard from a lot of students that when TAs or instructors reach out to students, that they appreciate that more than anything else. And if you notice that a student is struggling, reaching out, finding out what's going on, if they're disengaged, not assuming that it's because they don't want to do the work, right? But starting with a place of what's going on. This is a very sort of stressful semester, and it's not equally so for all students, right? So some students are not in an ideal learning environment right now. There's lots of outside events going on that are impacting our students differently. And so checking in with students, acknowledging outside events and sort of connecting those outside events to what we're doing in the classroom is really going to be helping sort of personalize for the students and helping them see that you sort of notice them. And I would also say that not forgetting to notice students when they're doing well too, right? And so part of that rigor is saying you're on the right track, right? Like, so you've made this improvement, now let's go for that next level. And so not forgetting that as well. And then the last thing I want to talk about in terms of misconception of rigor, and particularly since I'm talking to a group of new instructors, and Emily actually alluded to this a lot too, is that it's not perfect, right? You know, when we go into the classroom, not everything is going to be perfect. And I know this feels high stakes, depending on our own identity, right? If we don't fit the stereotype of who is an academic, that it feels like it needs to be perfect. But it's much more important to admit when we don't know the answer and showing our expertise and how to find the answer, as Emily said. And then the other piece of that, I would say, is being open to feedback. I know that feels really vulnerable, but that's certainly one of the biggest things that you can do to show the students that you care about them and that you care about their learning. And so I would just sort of leave you with the final thought that rigorous and inclusive teaching to me means, you know, being human first, showing that you care about the students, that you care about their learning, and then showing students the ways to sort of those high and rigorous standards by emphasizing what's important, letting them know how to approach their classes by, you know, letting them know what office hours are and how to engage with you and the other resources, and then giving students the feedback that they need in order to improve. So those are some of the big ideas I'd like to leave you with.
Great, Julie, thank you so much. Especially appreciate your anatomizing of the concept of rigor, which holds a silent grip on Yale and other elite institutions. And it's important to be really thoughtful about what it is our goals are for students and why we're holding certain practices up and not others. So thank you for that. That's great. Rona, I'm going to ask you to finish us out.
No pressure. After all of those amazing statements, I feel no pressure whatsoever. So when Suzanne asked me to be on this panel, she sent us a few questions to think about that we could talk about during this sort of our thoughts on inclusive teaching. And, there's maybe like 4 or 5 questions. I always get stuck on the first one, which is why is it important? And I think the reason why I always get stuck there is when I first started learning about inclusive teaching practices, the sort of context was always like, this is why it's great for the scientific community, right? So there's all these people who could be the next, brilliant Einstein, or whatever, the next, revolution in science. And that could be anyone, and we're excluding all of these people. So what are we missing out on, right? So there's that conversation. There's also the conversation about, diverse teams or diverse groups. They come up with really solid solutions that are not fragile. They come up with more creative solutions. So that was another thing that people said, like, this is why we need more diversity in the students that are going into science, right? And I thought, yeah, okay, all that stuff is great. I totally am on board with all of those things. Great science, I want that. I want an educated public that's going to vote and respect scientific expertise. I want that. All these things that people talked about in terms of like, why is inclusive teaching important? But it never like sat really well with me that was the context, because it, in some ways I felt like, why do we have to be convinced? Why do we have to define what the benefits of this, this movement should be to the scientific community? Why is this not something that should be a right for anyone who is interested in science? For any kid that, turned over a rock and saw like all these, strange beings and wondered like, what is this thing? I never knew this was here. What is happening? There's this whole world, right? And so I think that, at least for me, and maybe this is true for many people in the scientific community, is that's how it sort of, got shepherded into the conversation, is so we need this because it will make science better. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that, scientific knowledge and appreciation shouldn't be something that you allow people to have by defining who gets to, sit in a classroom and appreciate the intricacies of all of these different subjects. And so I think, I think maybe it's important to convince some people, but I think that the conversation is wrongheaded in that way, right? This should be a right. If someone wants to learn about science, if someone wants to be a scientist, if someone wants to be, the leader of the next scientific revolution, like, let's have them face no barriers to that. Let's support that and let that grow sort of naturally without having to overcome all of these other barriers. So I think that's like the thing that I always want to say whenever people start talking about inclusive teaching, because a lot of times it sort of was, it kind of, at least in the conversations that I've been in, have been like, okay, how do I do it? Like, what are the techniques? Like, what do I actually do? How do I structure my class? And of course, all of that is really important. You need to know how to do it, what works and why it works, and to figure out also, like, in your own particular classroom, like, what are the actual mechanics of doing these things? That's all really important, but I just want to, put that out there as, for me, this is the reason why you put effort into it. The smallest amount of effort would be just to do what we've been doing for the last, I don't know, however many years, 500 years, or however many years we've been in classrooms teaching people. So that would be the minimal effort, right? So it does take effort. You have to learn about this. Possibly for some of you, you've seen some of these kind of practices in class. For me, I never saw any of that. So I didn't even have an example of what was good. I had an example of what didn't work for me and for a lot of other people. but I didn't have any examples of what was effective and what was good. And now that information is out there, but it still takes legwork. You have to like figure out what might work in your classroom. You have to try it, and then if it fails, you got to figure out why it didn't work. I mean, you know, sort of your normal like learning how to do something, but it does take effort, right? And the reason why it's important to me to put that effort in is to think about, you know, that kid that like turns over the rock, that, you know, those sort of like flashes of like, wow, this is so cool. I want to understand and know more about this. And I feel like everyone should feel like if they have that experience, that they can go along a path where they can think about these things and understand it very deeply, and just, you know, have that experience, that amazing experience over and over again of like, wow, I can't believe this is how this works. I can't believe this is how it works. So that's what I like to think about when I'm in a classroom and the thing that I'm doing is like failing or it's not working out the way that I think it's going to work out. But I'm at least thinking about, okay, like I am learning from this experience and I want to make it better the next time I do it. And this is the reason why. And then I think, you know, just to also add to that, another thing that I think about is, you know, the people that you know, go on in science, and I think about my own experience of being in an intro science class, and then looking at the people in the classroom, like, okay, it's sort of normal class. Then the next level, I go to my majors class. Okay, people are starting to look different from what my intro class looks like. Graduate school, again, like fewer women, fewer minorities. A conference room, like, whoa, very, very different. Not like my graduate course, definitely not like the people in my intro science course, right? And so I think about this pipeline, and, you know, and I think about people who are getting to sort of the end of the line are the people that are influencing the scientific agenda. So this is the group that defines what is scientifically important, what we should throw money behind, what we should be thinking about. And that leaves so many people out of the equation. And it just doesn't, you know, like there are the benefits to society, you know, there's not just like the scientific canon, which of course we want more understanding, we want like to keep expanding how we understand the universe. But if you also think about how that sort of affects the you know, the way that people live, the standard of life, you know, and I'm thinking about like medical experiments and trials, and like whose bodies are being studied and how those things affect who gets, you know, what type of medicine, and, you know, what kind of, you know, understanding we have about these sorts of ways we treat people, and it doesn't treat people in the same way, right? There are things that are overlooked. Anyway, my point is that, you know, there are benefits to society that come from science, and the people that decide what we're pushing hard on in terms of the scientific agenda leave those people out. And I think, you know, if we're gonna not just improve our understanding of the universe, but also these benefits, they should go out to everybody, right? It shouldn't just be certain groups that are benefiting from what the scientific community is doing. So those are my two things.
Great, thank you so much, Rona. The focus on the big view of science and how the work that we're doing in each of our classes leads inexorably to the next generation of scientists is just really important to think about. And the why, you know, the idea that scientific knowledge, access to good teaching should be a human right. I salute you for that.